Welcome to Crisis Management. I'm Alicja Siekierska. On today's episode, Alberta is moving on from pandemic to endemic. The province is going to stop requiring that people who test positive for COVID-19 have to quarantine. So we're going to talk about the province's dramatic policy shift and what it says about the fight against the coronavirus. And while the federal government is lifting travel restrictions for Canadian travelers, Canadians are still a little hesitant to travel, especially to the US. We're going to dig into the latest poll results that dig into Canadians and how they're feeling these days about travel. Now, to get through all this, I am joined by Sean Speer. Sean is a fellow in residence at the Public Policy Forum. He previously served as senior economic advisor to Prime Minister Stephen Harper, and he's here to help us dig through the policy issues brought forward by COVID-19. Sean, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Alicia.
So let's kick things off with the major development that's coming out of Alberta. This week, the province announced that it will start treating COVID-19 like any other respiratory virus. That means that Alberta will no longer require that people who test positive for COVID-19 quarantine when they do test positive. Also, testing will no longer be recommended for mild symptoms of COVID-19. They'll also be scaling back things like contact tracing. Now, Alberta's Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Deena Henshaw, noted that with vaccines readily available, the need for extraordinary restrictions has diminished. Henshaw was asked at a press conference yesterday about the changing policy and the reasoning behind this pretty substantial shift. Here's part of what she had to say.
What we know from looking around the world is that COVID-19 will not be eliminated. We will be needing to live with this virus for years to come. And so what we need to decide as we look at the impacts of public health interventions, the choices about using a large amount of resources to focus on a single disease when there are many others that also cause illness and problems, and again, weighing the direct impacts of COVID-19 infection, is to make the determination about how we best utilize our public health resources and the human resources we have to provide the most benefit for the most people.
So as Henshaw noted there, essentially the province is no longer going to put most of its resources towards fighting COVID-19. Now, this response comes in stark contrast to what we're seeing in other provinces, including right next door to Alberta in BC, where mask mandates have actually been brought back in certain regions where the province is seeing COVID-19 cases rise. Now, Sean, let's talk about Alberta's approach. What do you make of it?
Well, it is a big deal. I think it represents a bit of a turning point, not just for the province of Alberta, Alicia, but for the entire country. In recent weeks, Alberta has been ahead of other provinces with respect to winding down these public health restrictions. Viewers, may have observed that the Calgary Stampede went off in the past several weeks. Essentially, as a business as usual type approach, and so far anyway, the story from that is reasonably positive. Just as recently as yesterday, report that while 84 cases came out of the Calgary Stampede, there were no instances of hospitalization or deaths. And so I think what we're hearing from the Alberta Public Health officer is, essentially that we're at a stage now where we can start to think about COVID-19 just like any other set of health risks that policymakers and businesses and the general public needs to confront and weigh, the costs and benefits of different activities or different behaviors. I guess maybe I'll just wrap up with this point, Alicia. I think it will put some pressure on other provincial governments across the country to follow suit. We've seen in New Brunswick and elsewhere waiving of mask mandates and further progress on reopening. And I think in this case, Alberta's leadership is going to start to put pressure on other provincial governments to, at minimum, justify why they're further behind Alberta when it comes to getting back to normal in our economy and society.
I do think it's becoming increasingly clear that not just Canada, but the world is going to have to find a way to live with the COVID-19 virus. But a key, as we've discussed on the show, to doing that is vaccination numbers. Alberta is slightly behind other provinces when it comes to vaccine numbers. I believe it's 63% are fully vaccinated. Now, we've discussed how vaccines are key to reopening and a return to normal. What impact do you think this policy shift may have on vaccine rates and Alberta's fight to kind of catch up to where other provinces are?
Well, that's a fascinating question, Alicia. On one hand, one could see a scenario where it takes pressure off of those who haven't been vaccinated to go out and get vaccinated. That the kind of costs of not being vaccinated will be minimized in an environment where, for all intents and purposes, the economy and the overall society are back to normal. I think this is where our discussion last week about the importance of some form of vaccine passport probably becomes even more significant as we see progress on reopening in Alberta and elsewhere across the country. It just seems to me that some form of passport or certificate will eventually become inevitable. Let me just draw from personal experience for a moment. A couple of weeks ago, my family and I traveled to New Brunswick, and upon arrival, we had to provide documentation showing that we were indeed fully vaccinated. That came in the form of a provincial document, but I think businesses, other governments, indeed governments around the world, I think will increasingly expect that for individuals to participate fully in the economy, to be able to travel and so on, these types of government issued documentation will be mandatory. And it seems to me that's one thing we haven't heard much from our provincial governments on. We've heard some premiers resist the idea of passports. I think a more kind of practical and constructive approach would be to conceive of ways that we can issue these types of passport certificates with minimal burden and minimal cost. That I think is where we're headed, and so it makes sense to get ahead of that now.
Do you think Alberta will have to inevitably head there? Because Premier Jason Kenney has been quite resistant and has said that that's not going to be on the table when it comes to vaccine passports, which is something Ontario Premier Doug Ford has also said. But it does seem like Ontario is holding off on lifting restrictions until our vaccination rates are much higher than what we're already seeing in Alberta.
Alberta is a major player in the global economy. It has both incoming and outgoing investment, and then, of course, with that, people. I suspect we'll get to a point, particularly given, the fact that the U.S. government hasn't opened the border yet. We had word this week that the UK government hasn't opened its borders to Canadian citizens. I just seems to me, Alicia, that at some point, sooner rather than later, the Alberta government and governments across the country are going to face pressure from their own citizens to come up with these types of solutions. So it's to enable them, particularly those who've been fully vaccinated, to fully benefit from the fact that they're now protected against the worst harms of this virus.
So let's talk about that border, because we are seeing COVID-19 case numbers in the U.S. rise, and it seems that as a result, Canadians are still wary of traveling south of the border. According to a new Yahoo Maru poll, 73% of Canadians do not think it's safe to travel or vacation in the United States due to the pandemic. In fact, this comes despite the fact that the federal government has loosened COVID-19 restrictions for travelers. Most are still planning on staying home over the next 6 months. Our poll also found that 51% of Canadians do not plan on traveling over the next 6 months, as you can see here. 35% said they will, of those that will stay within Canada. 9% will travel internationally, and 5% plan on visiting the US. So Sean, when you look at these results and Canadians' hesitancy to travel, what do you think it says about our approach to COVID-19?
Well, it's just so fascinating. From the very beginning, from the first time I joined you on this show, we talked about the extent to which public health restrictions were either leading the public or following the public. And fundamentally, it seemed to me at the time, and I think this poll demonstrates this, that, notwithstanding efforts to unwind some of these restrictions and open up our economy and society, there's still a degree of leeriness on the part of Canadians. That is to say, in a lot of ways, Canadians are self-regulating even more than public health restrictions may have at various points. And I think that comes down to one thing: uncertainty. Canadians know a little bit about some of these different variants. They're hearing about them on social media and their more mainstream news consumption. Of course, we have projected in our households every day news coming out of the United States, which tends to be polarized and disseminated through a kind of partisan lens. And I think all of those factors are leading Canadians to sort of impose on themselves even greater restrictions than our policymakers may. And I think that's going to be with us for some time. I think Canadians, after the last year, particularly the resurgence of the virus last fall and into the early winter, I think they're going to take a kind of wait to see approach if we have another wave in September, October, as things, get even more back to normal with school resuming and so on. And it'll only be after that experience that they truly feel like we've moved beyond the pandemic. And as such, we'll then start to think about booking travel and these sorts of things.
I think you're definitely right in that Canadians have really drastically changed their behavior. The poll also had results from before the pandemic, and it was 26% didn't take vacation, while 37% traveled within Canada and 38% traveled internationally. So you can see that swing from 38% to 9%. The behaviors have drastically changed. Maru also conducts similar polls in the U.S. I spoke to their vice president, John Wright, about this, and he said that in the U.S., the results are essentially the same, that before and after the pandemic, that the travel behavior is still extremely similar, and that Americans haven't changed their habits as much as we have here in Canada. But in the meantime, do you think that this presents opportunities in our local economies as Canadians stay home, potentially do some local road trips, particularly for the travel and tourism sector, which has just been devastated by the coronavirus pandemic?
Yeah, I'd say two things, Alicia. First, the point you just made, that, it may be that Canadian travel is now focused within our own borders, which is a great opportunity for different parts of the economy that have struggled. The second, though, is a sort of bigger question about overall consumer behavior. The question of household debt has been near the top of the policy agenda in Ottawa for years. And during the pandemic, in large part because of restrictions on economic activity, we've seen an increase in savings and some repairs to household balance sheets. It's going to be kind of fascinating to see whether people revert back to their pre-pandemic behaviors, which oftentimes involve spending more than was coming in, or whether we'll see just a kind of a greater overall consumer conservatism. Which wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. Higher rates of savings, higher rates of investment, will have consequences in the short term for our economy, but it could have really long-term benefits in terms of higher rates of investment, more stable household finances, which would take pressure off the Bank of Canada, which would impact federal regulatory policy and in various other ways. So, I think just in sum, yes, we'll certainly see more Canadian-based travel, and that is good in various ways. More fundamentally, though, I'm really fascinated to learn, whether this whole experience has, over the long term, changed the way people think about their household budget and their household finances, which would have, kind of major repercussions across our economy.
Definitely. I think you see a lot of people who manage to save a lot and realize how much they were spending on a day-to-day basis, just as a result of living day-to-day life in a normal way, that once you were shut into your homes, things really changed. Also, I wonder how much just in terms of taking on that debt, whether, lots of people were buying houses in this time. Maybe that has also changed people's ability to travel internationally, and instead they're saving up towards their homes. But Sean, I do want to continue this conversation related to travel. We're starting to hear issues from some travelers that are facing over the fact that they've received different doses of the COVID-19 vaccine. You'll recall that the Canada's National Advisory Committee on Immunization, NACI, said that mRNA vaccines like Pfizer and Moderna are interchangeable, and that AstraZeneca recipients as well could receive an mRNA vaccine as the second dose. So this means that millions of Canadians have received a bit of a mixed cocktail when it comes to their vaccines. And while Canada considers those people fully vaccinated, not everyone appears to be on board. We've heard of travelers facing issues in some European countries, meaning that they still have to quarantine on arrival. The UK has left fully vaccinated Canadians off its list of countries that don't need to quarantine upon entry, although they haven't signaled that it's due to mixed vaccines at this point. Cruise ships, there are some cruise ships as well that are not considering people with mixed doses fully vaccinated. And so it's gotten to the point where Quebec is planning on offering additional doses for people with mixed vaccines. And Ontario is urging the federal government to work with the World Health Organization to make sure that mixed vaccine doses are recognized internationally. This issue is not totally surprising, Sean, because Canada did take an approach that was a little bit different from what some countries were doing. They weren't certainly alone. But how do you think the government needs to respond here?
This is a big issue. One can't help but feel sorry for some of these people who are now really confused about what this all means for them and their families. Those who followed the rules, got into the queue, and obtained the first vaccine available to them, which is what policymakers were telling them to do. In fact, I think, if I recall correctly, Alicia, Prime Minister Trudeau received AstraZeneca, at least for his first dose, as did the Premier of Ontario and the Ontario Health Minister. So the signal was, don't ask questions, just get the first vaccine available. And now people are learning that may have implications for their ability to travel and participate fully in the economy and society. So, I think that the Ontario government's advocacy for Ottawa to kind of take leadership on this is correct. The provinces in a lot of ways have been following Ottawa's lead on these questions. And so I think that will require the federal government through the World Health Organization and other international forums to try to build the consensus that those who've received mixed vaccines, not just in Canada, but globally, shouldn't be subject to different restrictions. I'm afraid, Alicia, I don't have a good sense of how that type of advocacy would ultimately turn out. It's notable, for instance, that the American government, at least to my knowledge, has never approved the AstraZeneca vaccine for use within the United States. I think we're going to have to follow different paths on this. One is this type of global advocacy. Second, though, is I think we need to be prepared to provide follow-up vaccinations for those who did everything right. As I say, they followed the rules. And they shouldn't be punished. They shouldn't ultimately be punished for that.
Mm-hmm. And Canada, you're right, did kind of go on speaking of paths, on its own path when it comes to the rollout of vaccines. First, there was the focus on prioritizing the first dose and getting the first dose out to as many Canadians as possible, which meant extending the time between doses from what was originally supposed to be 28 days to up to 4 months. It's obviously shortened once we figured out our supply. And then, of course, there was the fact that we were having supply issues and the decision that mRNA vaccines can be used interchangeably. When you look at these decisions, they were obviously made with the advice from the Immunization Council. But do you think the government did a good job of balancing, public health needs with the reality of supply issues they were facing? Or was that an approach that was too risky?
It's a great question. It's tough to put oneself in the shoes of policymakers, particularly in just such an extraordinary set of circumstances. It's easy to be a bit of a Monday morning quarterback. I will say this, though, Alicia, that this question, given the not insignificant share of Canadians who could find themselves caught up in any restrictions that other countries impose with respect to mixed vaccines, is a bit of a sleeper issue in the world of Canadian politics. We're going to have an election campaign ostensibly in the next several weeks. The Prime Minister's one of the Prime Minister's kind of key arguments for not just re-election, but for renewed majority government will be Canada's progress on vaccines and on vaccinations. You see, for instance, the Federal Health Minister, Patty Hadju, frequently tweeting and posting on social media about all of this progress. But it comes with an asterisk, doesn't it? It comes with this share of the population that, well, technically vaccinated, may not have kind of a full access to different consumer and commercial and social activities that those of us who received the same vaccine twice may have. So, it'd be fascinating to see whether this issue becomes kind of hotter and hotter in the context of the campaign. And the fact that the Trudeau government may, face criticism and ultimately accountability from these individuals who, I just can't stress this point enough, followed precisely the rules and the instructions that they were receiving from policymakers. In a way, they were the first and the most obedient in the sense that they went out and got AstraZeneca, even though there was some questions about that, given that the U.S. government hadn't approved it. So, yeah, I really do think that this has the potential to be a bigger issue than many in the media and elsewhere are presently discussing it.
Yeah, you wonder if this continues or if this issue isn't resolved, that it's the big political win, as you said, that Trudeau is now pointing to, and if maybe people don't see it that way, if they're being prevented from traveling, that kind of thing. But Sean, I do want to move on to another topic. We've discussed a lot on the show about how businesses are grappling with a shortage of workers. And this week I wanted to focus on the government policy role in this hiring challenge, specifically when it comes to the Canada Recovery Benefit. Now, the CRB was introduced in the midst of the pandemic to help self-employed workers that did not qualify for regular EI payments. The initial payment was $500 per week. It's since been reduced to $300 per week as economies reopen and life gets back to normal. But some businesses are saying that CRB is still preventing workers from coming back to work, particularly when it comes to part-time employees. Now, we've seen this debate about unemployment benefits play out in the United States in particular. But Sean, what do you think? Is government money holding Canadians back from returning to work? Is this something that businesses are right to be concerned about?
I think the short answer is yes. We have kind of conceptual and anecdotal reasons to think that. I mean, if you step back for a second, the entire purpose of these programs was to support people not to fully participate in the economy as workers. That was the intention, and it worked. Of course, we were able to sustain workers and their households while the economy was subject to these extraordinary restrictions. And now as those restrictions come off, it's sort of intuitive that if people are continuing to receive such benefits, it may be a deterrence to going back into the economy, back into work. So it was always going to be a real balancing act on the part of the federal government to ensure that the benefits were there as long as they needed to be to support households and support workers, but not too long that it became a break or an impediment on the economy getting back to normal. And I think what you're hearing from some sectors and some employers is that we've reached that point, that as provinces like Alberta and others start to fully reopen their economy, there needs to be a kind of coordination with Ottawa on these different income support programs so as not to be an obstacle to employers in the economy getting back to business as usual. The challenge, of course, is given the prospective election campaign that we just talked about, there may be kind of small p political reasons why Ottawa is reluctant to start to wind down those benefits, at least until we're on the other side of the election campaign.
Yeah, and I think part of that too is because the response that you're hearing from some people is that this is an issue of quality of work and that pay is the bigger problem as opposed to these government supports. What do you make of that argument?
Well, I think there's something to that. When employers complain about labor shortages, sometimes what they're really saying is there's not enough labor at the price that we want to pay. And so I do think that we're going to have to see employers provide higher rates of pay going forward as we deal with some of the long-term labor shortage issues that we've talked about on this program over the past couple of weeks. But that doesn't change the fact that in the short term, the presence of these extraordinary income support programs. I mean, this is important for viewers to understand. This isn't kind of conventional employment insurance that supports people when they lose their jobs. These were extraordinary programs designed to deal with an extraordinary set of circumstances. As long as those are in place, there's going to be workers on the margins who are staying on the sidelines and staying out of the economy. So I guess maybe just I think the answer is yes in both regards. First, we need to see more progress on the part of the federal government winding down these programs. And two, over the long term, employers are going to have to be prepared to pay for labor in a world of increasing labor scarcity. Both of those things can be correct.
Okay, Sean, now before we wrap up the show, I do want to talk about that return to work and an approach that maybe we haven't actually discussed on the show. It's called the traveling office. The Globe and Mail featured a story this week about Laser Technologies. They're a Toronto tech startup that is going to be moving its office to different locations around the world. Basically, for 1 month every quarter, Laser is going to set up shop at a new destination. So first they're in Costa Rica, and next quarter will be Uruguay. And employees will have the option of either working from home or joining for part or the whole month. The company is relatively small, about 60 employees, and 80% of them are under the age of 30. So that's kind of why it's being offered as an incentive. But Sean, what do you think? Would you want to work in this kind of traveling office?
Well, Costa Rica during a Canadian winter doesn't sound too bad. I would just say this, Alicia. Well, there's this sort of interesting novelty here. I do think in a world in which globalization is under threat, that there are kind of greater questions around the commitment on the part of different companies to the countries in which they operate, to the communities in which they operate. I actually think the world is sort of moving in the opposite direction. That communities, that countries are going to be asking companies to make kind of deeper commitments to the places in which they have workers, in which they produce products, and so on. So, in some ways, notwithstanding the novelty, I wonder if this company isn't actually kind of reading the room wrong, and that in the kind of post-pandemic reconfiguration of globalization, we'll see companies that are most successful are ones that are making deeper commitments to countries and communities.
Interesting. Okay, well, Sean, we're going to have to leave it there. Maybe next month we'll try the show out from Costa Rica. That would be fun. But thank you so much for the conversation, as always.
Thanks, Alicia.
And now, if you want to rewatch this episode or get more news about the coronavirus pandemic, please check out Yahoo Finance Canada's website. For more bonus content, make sure you check out our podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And if you have any questions for Sean or feedback about the show, please feel free to email me. I'm at alicia@yahoofinance.com. Thanks for tuning in.